The heat in Washington, D.C. during August 1940 was oppressive, but inside the munitions building on Constitution Avenue, William Friedman barely noticed. At 48 years old, Friedman was the chief cryptanalyst for the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, and he was staring at a problem that had consumed him for over a year, a series of encrypted Japanese diplomatic messages that defied every conventional code-breaking technique he knew. Friedman sat at his desk, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in seemingly random characters, encrypted messages intercepted from Japanese diplomatic communications between Tokyo and their embassy in Washington. The messages were gibberish, strings of 5-digit number groups that followed no discernible pattern. But Friedman knew they contained secrets, information about Japanese intentions, diplomatic negotiations, military planning. If he could break this code, if he could read what Tokyo was telling its diplomats, America would gain an invaluable window into Japanese strategy. The problem was that this wasn't a code in the traditional sense. Friedman had broken codes before. The earlier Japanese red and blue codes had fallen to his team's analysis. But this new system, which the Americans had designated purple, was different. It wasn't a codebook system where words were replaced by numbers or symbols. It was a machine cipher generated by an electromechanical device similar to the German Enigma machine. And without knowing the machine's internal wiring, without understanding its stepping mechanism and rotor arrangements, breaking it seemed impossible. "Chief, you need to go home," said Frank Rowlett, Friedman's deputy and one of the most talented cryptanalysts in the Signal Intelligence Service. Rowlett was 32, a former mathematics teacher from Virginia who had joined SIS in 1930 and quickly proven himself a genius at pattern recognition. He stood in the doorway of Friedman's office, concern evident on his face. "You've been here for 16 hours straight. You're going to collapse." "I'm close, Frank," Friedman replied without looking up. "There's a pattern in the stepping sequence. I can feel it. The way the cipher alphabets change, it's not random. There's an underlying mechanism, and if I can just understand it—" "You've been saying that for 3 months. You're exhausted. Your hands are shaking. Elizabeth is worried about you." At the mention of his wife, herself an accomplished cryptanalyst who worked on different projects, Friedman finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. He had lost 15 pounds in the past few months, sleeping irregularly, eating sporadically, obsessed with breaking purple. "The Japanese switched to this system in February 1939, Friedman said. "For 18 months, we've been blind to their highest-level diplomatic communications. Blind, Frank. We can read lower-level messages, consular traffic, but the important stuff, the messages between Foreign Minister Matsuoka and Ambassador Nomura, the instructions from Tokyo about negotiations, military deployments, strategic planning, it's all in purple, and we can't read it." "I know, Chief, but killing yourself won't help us break it." Friedman knew Rowlett was right, but he couldn't let it go. The international situation was deteriorating rapidly. Japan had invaded China, signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, and was making aggressive moves throughout Asia. War was coming. Everyone in the intelligence community could see it. And when it came, America would face enemies on 2 fronts, in both Europe and the Pacific. Reading Japanese diplomatic communications might provide the warning that could save thousands of American lives. "Tomorrow," Friedman promised, "let me work on this stepping sequence analysis 1 more hour, then I'll go home." But it wasn't 1 hour. It was 4 more hours. And when Friedman finally left the munitions building at 2 a.m., stumbling with exhaustion, he had made a breakthrough. The purple machine, he realized, didn't use rotors like Enigma. It used telephone stepping switches, uniselector switches that rotated through positions in a specific sequence, and that sequence could be deduced through statistical analysis of the encrypted messages. Over the next 3 weeks, working with Rowlett and a small team of cryptanalysts, Friedman reconstructed the logic of the purple machine without ever seeing one. Using telephone equipment scrounged from various sources, they built their own purple analog, a machine that could decrypt Japanese messages even though they had no idea what the actual Japanese device looked like. On September 25, 1940, the team successfully decrypted their first complete purple message. It was diplomatic traffic from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, discussing trade negotiations and oil embargoes. Nothing earth-shattering, but proof that their replica machine worked. Friedman stood in the cramped SIS workroom, watching the decrypted plain text emerge from their homemade machine, and felt tears running down his face. They had done the impossible. They had recreated a machine cipher device through pure analytical reasoning and mathematics, with no access to the original device, no stolen blueprints, no captured equipment. It was one of the greatest achievements in the history of cryptanalysis, but the victory came at a terrible personal cost. The strain of the previous 18 months had devastated Friedman's health. Within weeks of breaking purple, he suffered a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for 3 months. He would recover, but he would never be quite the same. The obsessive drive that had enabled him to break purple had nearly destroyed him. In his absence, Frank Rowlett took over day-to-day management of the purple decryption operation. The Army and Navy divided responsibility for processing the intercepted messages, alternating days, Army days and Navy days, they called it. Translators worked around the clock converting decrypted Japanese into English. The resulting intelligence reports were given the code name Magic, and they were distributed to a small group of senior officials on a strict need-to-know basis. Among those receiving Magic summaries was Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, head of the Far East section of the Office of Naval Intelligence. McCollum was a 41-year-old intelligence officer who had grown up in Japan, spoke fluent Japanese, and understood Japanese culture and military thinking better than almost any American. He sat in his office at the Navy Department building, reading the latest Magic intercepts with growing concern. It was November 1941, and the messages painted a troubling picture. Tokyo was instructing Ambassador Nomura to continue negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, while simultaneously preparing for military action. Intercepts revealed Japanese interest in detailed intelligence about Pearl Harbor, the number of ships, their positions, the routines of American forces. Other messages showed Japan preparing to occupy French Indochina and possibly attack British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia. "We're going to war with Japan," McCollum told his assistant, Lieutenant Commander Henry Smith Hutton. "It's not a question of if, but when, and these intercepts suggest they're planning something big, something soon." "Have you briefed Admiral Stark?" Smith Hutton asked, referring to Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations. "I've briefed everyone who's cleared for Magic. But here's the problem. We have diplomatic intelligence showing that Japan is preparing for war, but we don't have specific tactical intelligence about where or when they'll strike. The military doesn't use purple for operational planning. They use their own naval codes, JN-25 primarily, and we haven't fully broken that yet." This was the critical limitation of Magic. The decrypts revealed Japanese diplomatic thinking, strategic intentions, and high-level decision-making. But they didn't contain specific military orders, fleet movements, or operational plans. Those were transmitted using different codes that the Americans were still working to break. On December 6, 1941, a long message began arriving at the Japanese embassy in Washington, transmitted in purple from Tokyo. It was delivered in 14 parts over several hours. American intercept stations picked up every part, and Army and Navy cryptanalysts worked through the night decrypting and translating it. Colonel Rufus Bratton, chief of the Far Eastern section of Army Intelligence, received the first 13 parts around midnight. He read them with mounting alarm. It was clear this was Japan's final diplomatic message, breaking off negotiations. The 14th part, which hadn't yet arrived, would presumably contain the actual declaration. Bratton immediately tried to alert senior officials, but it was Saturday night, and most were unreachable. He called General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, but Marshall had gone to the movies and couldn't be contacted. He called Secretary of War Henry Stimson, but Stimson's aide said the Secretary shouldn't be disturbed at that hour. So Bratton waited through the night, the decrypted message on his desk, knowing that war was coming but unable to effectively warn anyone. The 14th part arrived early on December 7th. It directed Ambassador Nomura to deliver the complete message to Secretary of State Hull at exactly 1 p.m. Washington time. Colonel Bratton and his Navy counterpart, Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer, both realized immediately what this meant. Something was scheduled to happen at 1 p.m. Washington time. That was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. Bratton finally reached General Marshall at his quarters around 10:30 a.m. Marshall read the decrypt and immediately ordered a warning message sent to all Pacific commands, including Pearl Harbor. But the message was sent by commercial telegram because atmospheric conditions had disrupted military radio communications. It arrived in Honolulu hours after the attack had already begun. At Pearl Harbor, at 7:55 a.m. local time on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck without warning. The attack devastated the Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 18 ships and killing 2,403 Americans. It was the worst naval disaster in American history. In the immediate aftermath, as investigations began, as Congress demanded answers about how America could have been caught so completely by surprise, the MAGIC program came under intense scrutiny. How could cryptanalysts have been reading Japanese diplomatic messages for over a year and still failed to prevent Pearl Harbor? The answer was complex and frustrating. MAGIC had provided strategic warning. The intercepts clearly showed Japan preparing for war, but they hadn't provided tactical warning of the specific target or timing of the attack. The Pearl Harbor operation had been planned and executed under strict radio silence, with orders transmitted via courier rather than by radio where they could be intercepted. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the attack, knew that Japanese codes might be compromised and took extraordinary precautions. Moreover, MAGIC distribution had been too restricted. Commanders in the field, including Admiral Kimmel and General Short at Pearl Harbor, weren't cleared to receive MAGIC intercepts. They knew Japan was hostile, knew war was likely, but they didn't have access to the specific intelligence that might have led them to expect an imminent attack. After Pearl Harbor, these distribution policies changed dramatically. MAGIC intercepts began flowing to theatre commanders who needed them, and the code-breaking effort intensified, with more resources devoted to breaking Japanese military codes like JN-25B, which carried actual operational orders. The breakthrough on JN-25B came from Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, where Commander Joseph Rochefort led a team of Navy cryptanalysts working around the clock. Rochefort was a brilliant, eccentric officer who worked in a basement facility wearing a bathrobe because the space was refrigerated to keep the computing equipment cool. His team had been working on JN-25B since before Pearl Harbor, but the code was much more difficult than Purple. It used a codebook plus an additive cipher, with both the codebook and the additives changing periodically. By April 1942, Rochefort's team had achieved about 10 to 15% penetration of JN-25B, enough to read portions of messages, but not enough to reconstruct complete texts. But sometimes 10–15% was enough, especially when combined with traffic analysis, direction finding, and pattern recognition. In May 1942, intercepts began showing Japanese references to an operation at a location designated AF. The Japanese were gathering forces for a major offensive, but where was AF? Rochefort believed it was Midway Island, a strategic American base in the Central Pacific. But his superiors in Washington disagreed, thinking it might be the Aleutian Islands or even the American West Coast. Rochefort proposed a clever ruse to confirm his theory. He had Midway send a message in plain language reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of water. Confirmation: AF was Midway, and the Japanese were planning a massive carrier strike to capture the island, destroy the remaining American carriers, and potentially force the US to negotiate peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received daily briefings from Rochefort on the developing intelligence picture. The intercepts revealed that 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would attack Midway on approximately June 4th. They also revealed supporting forces, diversionary attacks in the Aleutians, and the composition of the invasion fleet. Armed with this intelligence, Nimitz positioned his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese fleet. It was a calculated risk. If the intelligence was wrong, if Rochefort had misinterpreted the intercepts, the American carriers might be sailing into a trap or leaving other areas vulnerable. But the intelligence was correct. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, sinking 3 carriers in 5 minutes and a 4th later that day. It was the turning point of the Pacific War, and it was made possible by code breaking. The success at Midway validated the code breaking effort and ensured continued investment in SIGINT, signals intelligence. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, American cryptanalysts continued breaking Japanese codes, not just Purple and JN-25, but dozens of others used by different branches of the Japanese military. Magic intercepts revealed Japanese strategy, diplomatic efforts, and internal disagreements when Japan's ambassador to Germany, General Hiroshi Oshima, visited Hitler and toured the Atlantic Wall defenses in early 1944. He sent detailed reports back to Tokyo describing German fortifications, troop deployments, and defensive plans. American cryptanalysts decrypted these messages, providing Allied commanders with invaluable intelligence about German preparations for defending against the D-Day invasion. General George Marshall later said that Ambassador Oshima was our main basis of information regarding Hitler's intentions in Europe. The Japanese ambassador, believing his purple encrypted messages were absolutely secure, provided the Allies with inside information about German military planning that no Allied spy could have obtained. But Magic's value went beyond military intelligence. The diplomatic intercepts revealed Japanese thinking about potential peace negotiations, their assessment of American resolve, their evaluation of the war situation. This intelligence proved crucial in 1945 as the war approached its end. In the spring of 1945, Magic intercepts showed Japan's desperate attempts to negotiate Soviet mediation for a peace settlement. Foreign Minister Togo sent multiple messages to Ambassador Sato in Moscow, seeking Stalin's help in arranging negotiations with the Allies. The intercepts revealed that Japan's leadership was split. Some wanted to fight to the bitter end, others sought a negotiated peace that would preserve the imperial system. President Harry Truman and his advisers read these intercepts carefully. They revealed that Japan would not surrender unconditionally without additional pressure. This intelligence factored into the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the belief that only such devastating attacks would convince Japan's military leadership to accept surrender. After the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war, magic intercepts captured the Japanese government's internal deliberations about surrender. Even then, military hardliners wanted to continue fighting, and it took Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention to force acceptance of Allied terms. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Throughout the conflict, magic had provided American leaders with unprecedented insight into enemy thinking, but it had remained so secret that most Americans, and even most people in the military and government, knew nothing about it. The secrecy was so complete that when the war ended, the codebreakers were simply sent home with orders never to discuss their work. No public acknowledgement, no medals, no recognition. They had helped win the war, but they couldn't tell anyone. William Friedman, who had broken purple and launched the magic program, returned to peacetime work at the newly formed National Security Agency. He never fully recovered from his 1940 breakdown, but he continued contributing to American cryptology for decades. He died in 1969, age 78, having lived to see his achievement finally declassified and recognized. Frank Rowlett also continued in signals intelligence, helping establish the NSA and working on Cold War code-breaking programs. He remained with the agency until his retirement, training new generations of cryptanalysts. Joe Rochefort, whose work breaking JN-25 enabled the Midway victory, was less fortunate. Due to bureaucratic conflicts with Washington, he was removed from command of Station Hypo in 1942 and never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. Only decades later, after his death, was he posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his contributions to the Midway victory. The magic program itself remained classified until the 1970s, when documents began to be declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. For 30 years after the war, the American public didn't know that the US had been reading Japanese diplomatic messages before Pearl Harbor. When the information finally became public, it triggered new debates about what officials knew before the attack and whether they could have prevented it. The truth is more nuanced than conspiracy theories suggest. Magic provided strategic warning of Japanese intentions, but not tactical warning of specific operations. Distribution of magic intercepts before Pearl Harbor was too restricted, with field commanders not receiving intelligence they needed. And even perfect intelligence can't prevent disaster if it's not acted upon effectively, as demonstrated by the failed attempt to warn Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. But whatever failures occurred before Pearl Harbor, magic and the broader code-breaking effort proved invaluable throughout the war. The Midway victory, which changed the course of the Pacific War, was made possible by breaking JN-25. Intelligence from Ambassador Oshima's reports helped plan D-Day. Insight into Japanese peace feelers informed decisions about how to end the war. The code breakers, mathematicians, linguists, clerks, intercept operators, machine operators, worked in obscurity, their contributions unknown even to their families. They couldn't explain why they worked strange hours, why they looked exhausted, why they seemed preoccupied. They simply did their jobs, day after day, solving puzzles that saved lives. Lieutenant Commander Henry Smith Hutton, who had worked with McCollum in naval intelligence and had access to magic from the beginning, later reflected on the program's significance. We could read what Tokyo was telling its ambassadors before the ambassadors themselves could decrypt the messages. We knew Japanese negotiating positions, their fallback positions, their real intentions. It was like playing poker when you could see the other player's cards. It didn't guarantee we'd win every hand, but it gave us an enormous advantage. That advantage, purchased through the brilliance of cryptanalysts like Friedman and Rochefort, through the tedious work of thousands of support personnel, through the courage of radio intercept operators stationed on remote islands listening to enemy transmissions, helped win World War II. The machines they built, the techniques they developed, the organizational structures they created became the foundation for modern signals intelligence. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, traced its lineage directly to Friedman's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's communication intelligence units that had run MAGIC. Today, the original purple machine that Friedman's team built without ever seeing a Japanese device resides in the National Cryptologic Museum in Maryland. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity, to the power of mathematics and logic, to what determined people can accomplish when the stakes are highest. The men and women who broke MAGIC and gave America the ability to read Japan's secret messages didn't win the war by themselves, but they provided the intelligence that informed strategy, enabled victories like Midway, and helped leaders make crucial decisions. They proved that in modern warfare, information is as important as firepower, that reading the enemy's mail can be as valuable as sinking his ships. That was Project Magic, not just a code-breaking program, but a window into enemy thinking that changed how wars are fought and won.